They called him the hope of the Tudor dynasty, the son who would finally erase the shadows cast by his father's blood-soaked crown, born from obsession, forged in political marriages, and raised under the weight of 1,000 prayers. Edward was the one child King Henry VIII had longed for his entire life. He was supposed to live long, rule wisely, and pass the Tudor name to his own sons and grandsons. But fate never cared for plans, and history never promised mercy. Instead of growing old with power in his hands, Edward died, a boy coughing up blood in a cold palace room, his body wasting away day by day, while the throne he was born to rule passed silently into the hands of others. His coffin, made of lead, buried in a vault no larger than a closet, would remain forgotten for centuries until someone opened it. What they found inside would haunt even the most hardened historians. Edward was only 9 years old when his father, King Henry VIII, finally died. The court dressed the boy in royal robes, crowned him in Westminster Abbey, and built a regency council around him, because no one believed a child could rule a kingdom alone. And maybe they were right. From the moment he took the throne, Edward was surrounded by whispers, conspiracies, and decisions made in his name, but never truly his. His uncle, Edward Seymour, styled himself Lord Protector and made himself the real power behind the curtain. Yet even then, Edward showed promise, a boy king with intelligence beyond his years and a terrifying understanding of what it meant to wear the crown. But power, like the body, is fragile. In the year 1550, Edward fell ill for the first time. It was serious enough that his royal physicians feared for his life. The nature of the sickness was unclear. Perhaps it was tuberculosis, perhaps another wasting disease, but the court panicked. If Edward died, who would take the throne? His elder sister Mary, a devout Catholic. His younger sister Elizabeth, a Protestant with no experience. Neither choice pleased those who had power. And so Edward's illness was hidden. But the sickness returned. Measles, smallpox, and long bouts of fever began to erode the boy's strength. He wore glasses. He became hard of hearing. But still, he kept up appearances. Still, he smiled at foreign ambassadors. Still, he walked the gardens, pretending his lungs weren't filling with blood. By the end of December in the year 1552, no one could pretend anymore. The measles had destroyed his immune system. His fever became constant. His cough turned violent. On the 15th of February, in the year 1553, his sister Mary visited him and found him shivering, eyes glassy, struggling to breathe. Rumors of poison began to swirl around the palace halls. No one knew who to trust. And then, like some grim joke, a woman with a reputation as a healer was allowed into the royal chambers. She gave the boy a potion that caused his limbs to swell and nearly killed him. And still, no one stopped her. By March, Edward was gaunt and gray, coughing up blood and unable to walk without assistance. Doctors tried everything. They gave him powders, pills, and elixirs. They changed his bedding daily. They brought in priests, but it was useless. By June, he could no longer eat. By the 1st of July, he was seen only at a distance, pale and hollow, staring out of a window at a world that was already beginning to forget him. On the 6th of July, in the year 1553, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, Edward died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. His final words were whispered through cracked lips. "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit. What followed was not a royal burial. It was a performance. They embalmed him. Yes, they placed his tiny body into a lead coffin, sealed it, and arranged a grand procession to carry him to Westminster Abbey. Candles lit the way. Courtiers wept, but beneath the pageantry, there was rot. No great tomb was built. No monument raised. They debated whether he should lie near his father. In Windsor, they never decided. Instead, his body was quietly lowered into a narrow marble vault beneath an altar, a vault no wider than 75 centimeters. No statue, no sculpture, just stone. Then the altar itself was destroyed. Decades later, by Puritan hands during the English Civil War, the king was not only dead, he was erased. But history does not stay buried. In the year 1868, over 300 years after Edward's death, his vault was opened. What they found was not a preserved prince. The wooden outer shell of his coffin had rotted, the lead casing had warped. In places, it had collapsed. The fabric meant to preserve his body had disintegrated, exposing his bones. The cerecloth had failed. His skull had no hair left. His limbs had blackened from centuries of gas buildup. And worst of all, there were signs the tomb had been tampered with, cracked open, perhaps by those same Puritan vandals, perhaps by others. No repairs were made. No new coffin was provided. The king's remains were simply left as they were skeletal, broken, exposed. Even now, there is no true tomb for Edward VI. No grand stone declares his place in history, only a small memorial slab. Placed on the 7th of October in the year 1966 by the Christ's Hospital in gratitude to their founder, marks the location of the forgotten boy king. And beneath that stone, the shattered coffin still rests, and maybe, just maybe, the skull of a dead king still stares into the silence. The child who was supposed to save the dynasty instead became its ghost. He was never just a child. From the moment Edward breathed his first breath in the autumn of the year 1537, he became a vessel for prophecy. England had waited years for him. His birth was not a quiet moment of joy between mother and father. It was a trumpet blast to the kingdom. A victory over the curse of daughters that had haunted Henry VIII since the day his first wife failed to give him a son. Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, had done what no other woman could. She had produced the heir, but there was no celebration in her eyes. Just days after giving birth, Jane was dead, bled out by infection and silence. And the infant who was supposed to bring light into the king's life instead grew up in its long, cold shadow. Edward did not know his mother. Her face lived in a portrait, her name whispered in prayers. But her arms had never held him. Henry had her painted as the perfect wife, the quiet queen, the noble mother of a future king, and Edward, perhaps unknowingly, tried to live up to the woman he would never meet. Raised by tutors rather than a mother's touch, guided by political ambition rather than affection, he was molded into something England could project its hopes onto: a Protestant Messiah, a child touched by God, chosen to lead the realm into a new era of reform, of righteousness, of strength. He was barely walking when his education began. Latin, Greek, theology, history, philosophy. Edward absorbed them all. He was not just bright, he was brilliant. His tutors marveled at his ability to quote scripture, to argue doctrine, to write letters with clarity and command. He had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of duty. Unlike his father, He took no interest in jousting or music or wine. There were no lovers, no mistresses, no scandals. His life was one of books, prayers, and responsibility. And yet, even in this bubble of piety, there were cracks, because every child, no matter how groomed, is still a child. Edward's world was full of men who claimed to serve him but served only themselves. His uncles, Edward Seymour, and later John Dudley, took the titles of Lord Protector and ruled in his name. They pushed policies through Parliament. They waged wars. They made enemies. And Edward, watching from behind velvet curtains, learned the cost of power. He began to write in his journals not just about theology or reform, but about execution. He recorded with detached interest how traitors were killed, how rebels were hanged. He did not cry when his own uncle was beheaded. He called it justice. Some would later say that this was the moment the boy king began to harden not into cruelty, but into coldness, a necessary distance. Perhaps, for one who was expected to carry the fate of a nation. Yet even kings cannot command their own flesh. It began subtly. A cough that lingered too long. A tiredness that could not be shaken. The court physicians dismissed it. Boys grew tired, especially those who studied so hard. But the cough deepened. His appetite waned. He began to look thin, almost hollow. When he fell ill in the year 1550, it was quietly terrifying. He was only 13, and the kingdom had no clear successor. Mary, his Catholic half-sister, was tolerated but not trusted. Elizabeth, his younger Protestant sister, was intelligent but unproven. The council panicked. But Edward recovered, or so it seemed. He stood. He smiled. He wrote letters. But behind closed doors, the sickness never truly left. By the end of 1552, Edward's body began to betray him in earnest. The boy once praised for his discipline now lay in bed for hours, coughing into cloths stained red. He was given potions, charms, Ava folk remedies. Nothing worked. His skin grew pale, almost translucent. His voice, once strong and certain, became thin and hoarse. He could barely lift a book. But he never once asked why. He never pleaded, never wept. He had been raised to believe that suffering was holy, that pain was a test, and so he endured it silently, faithfully, tragically. One night, a woman of unknown origin was allowed into his chambers. She was not noble, not educated, not approved by the court, but someone had heard she could heal. She gave Edward a draught that made his limbs balloon, his face flush purple. He nearly died that night, not from his illness, but from the fear of those who claimed to save him. After that, the guards were tightened. Only the most trusted doctors were allowed near him. But by then, it was too late. Whatever illness plagued him, consumption, measles, a cancer, it had taken root in every corner of his frame. And yet, even in his last weeks, Edward remained king. He held audiences from bed. He signed documents with trembling hands. He made decisions, dictated letters, and asked pointed questions about the stability of his succession. He feared that if Mary took the throne, everything he believed in Protestantism, reform, truth would be burned away. And so he reached for something desperate. He altered the line of succession, not to his sisters, but to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a girl only slightly older than himself. Educated, obedient, Protestant, a safe choice. a political puppet, a gamble. But Edward would never know how that gamble played out. In his final days, he could no longer eat. His hair fell in clumps. Sores appeared across his back and stomach. His hands, once precise, could no longer hold a pen. He was moved to Greenwich Palace in hopes the fresh air would help. It did not. On his worst night, he could no longer lie on his side. He choked on his own breath. And yet, still, no one prepared a tomb. Still, no one imagined that this boy, this king, would truly die. On the 6th of July, the year 1553, as the sun began to set and the bells of London prepared to toll, Edward whispered his last words. "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." He died not with the roar of kings, but with the quiet plea of a boy who had never truly lived outside of duty. The doctors opened his chest and found ulcers in his lungs. The embalming was done quickly. Quietly, his body was placed into a lead coffin, sealed, and transported by barge under the cover of night. Westminster Abbey received him without fanfare. His coffin was lowered into a vault, barely larger than a grave. No tomb was built, no epitaph carved, no monument raised. And so the boy, who had once been prophecy, became a question. Why did he die so young? What truly killed him? Was it disease, poison, politics? The records offer no clarity. The answers remain buried, much like his damaged coffin. And yet one thing is certain. Edward was not just a child of prophecy. He was a child of silence. His life was shaped by the voices of others, but his death left only questions that no one dared ask aloud. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that he died, but that we still don't know who he truly was. There are illnesses that whisper, and there are illnesses that scream. Edward's began as a whisper, a tightness in the chest, a dull ache behind the eyes, a fever that rose and fell with no rhythm. But by the end, it was all screaming. The body of the boy king, once held up by prophecy and pageantry, began to unravel. And what followed was a slow, terrible collapse, not just of the flesh, but of trust, of reason, of loyalty itself. Behind every drawn curtain and sealed chamber door, people whispered rumors. Some said he had been poisoned. Some said it was God's wrath. Some said nothing. Because in the Tudor court, silence was often the only thing that kept you alive. It was December in the year 1552 when the tide began to turn, and Edward's illness declared war on his body. He had endured before measles, smallpox, wasting fevers that left him weak for weeks. But this was different. This time, the coughs did not fade. They deepened, scraping up from his chest, like rust being ripped from old metal. The boy who once walked the gardens of Whitehall and studied scriptures until candlelight gave out, could no longer sit upright without pain. And still, he tried. He attended council meetings from his bed, his face pale and lips cracked, and he spoke in gasps, determined to hold the crown with both hands until death pried it from him. By February of the next year, his condition had worsened. His sister Mary came to visit, a strained reunion between two halves of the same broken royal family. She was Catholic. He was not. She had been set aside by their father for years, and now she stood by the bed of her younger brother, seeing in him not only a fading boy, but also a kingdom slipping through her fingers. Edward, though barely able to breathe, insisted he was recovering. He told her it was only a cold, but she could see it. The tremble in his hands, The way he clutched the bed linens like they might hold him together. The fever that made his eyes gleam with unnatural brightness. And the cough, the terrible, rattling cough that sprayed red across his sleeves. The royal physicians could not agree on what they were treating. Some claimed it was consumption of the lungs. Others suspected complications from his earlier childhood diseases. One whispered, it was a wasting fever. Something foreign. Something they could not name. The court brought in more doctors, more surgeons, more healers, and with them came desperation. Every failed remedy left the air heavier with panic. People stopped speaking openly about Edward's condition. The term recovering became a political lie, repeated with nervous smiles in letters to foreign courts and ambassadors. But in the silence of Edward's rooms, the truth was growing louder every day. Then came the woman. Her name was never officially recorded, not in the royal journals, not in the physician's logs, but her presence was known, whispered among the servants and attendants, like a curse passed hand to hand. She was not noble. She was not educated. She had no title and no official reason to be inside the king's apartments. But someone, perhaps a desperate courtier or a frightened servant, had heard of her powers. She was said to be a healer, a woman of herbs and roots, someone who could cure what physicians could not. Perhaps she was a fraud. Perhaps she believed in her own magic. Perhaps she was something in between, the kind of shadowy figure Tudor England loved to both revere and burn. One evening, while the moon hung low and pale over the Thames, she was brought in under a veil of secrecy. The usual guards were given new postings. The usual doctors were told to rest, and this strange woman, smelling of camphor and earth, was led into the chamber where Edward lay dying. She brought with her a small pouch, filled with tinctures and vials. She examined the boy, his sunken eyes, his swollen limbs, the bruises blooming across his chest. And then, without ceremony, she prepared a draught. Accounts differ on what it contained. Some say it was made of foxglove, a plant both healing and deadly. Others say it contained mercury, or crushed beetle shell, or bitter wormwood. Whatever the ingredients, they were poured into a small goblet and pressed to the king's lips. Edward drank. What happened next nearly killed him faster than the illness itself. Within an hour, his limbs began to swell. His face turned the color of bruised plum. His pulse raced, then stuttered. He began to scream not words, just noise. Raw and terrified, the attendants who had remained rushed in, and the woman who had administered the potion was gone, vanished like smoke. Some said she had never existed at all. Others claimed they saw her slip into the river later that night, her skirts soaked and her eyes empty. The court never investigated. The matter was buried. Quickly, quietly, officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, it became the moment many believed Edward would never truly recover. After the incident, access to the king was restricted even further. No one entered his chambers without permission from the Lord President of the Council. The curtains were kept drawn, the windows closed. The air inside grew heavy, humid, filled with the smells of sickness, sour sweat, dried blood, spoiled linen. Edward's body continued to betray him. His feet and legs ballooned with fluid. His fingernails turned black. The ulcers that had first appeared on his back now spread to his arms, his thighs, his neck. His voice, once sharp with boyish command, became a whisper barely distinguishable from the crackle of the fireplace. Still, he did not cry. Still, he tried to rule a deuce the Beluta. Still, he asked to see the latest bills, to be read the letters from abroad, to dictate notes to be sent to his council. He asked about Elizabeth. He asked about Jane. He asked what would happen if he died, and who would truly inherit England. He had been taught, since he could speak, that a king must never leave uncertainty behind. And yet, all around him, uncertainty reigned. By May, he was no longer able to stand. A special sling was devised to carry him from bed to chair, from chamber to balcony, in hopes the sun might strengthen him. It did not. His appetite vanished entirely. He vomited water. He wept blood from the corners of his eyes. At times, he fell into fever dreams, calling out to his long-dead mother, begging her not to leave him again. Servants would later whisper that, in those last weeks, Edward began to see things, shadows in the corners of the room, figures no one else could see, voices no one else could hear. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the fever. Or perhaps, in those final days, the veil between this world and the next had thinned just enough for a dying boy to glimpse what lay beyond. Then came June, the month when his breathing became wet and ragged, when the coughing fits left him too weak to speak for hours, when his skin turned waxen, his eyes sunken. On some nights, the palace attendants feared he would not live until morning. And yet, somehow, it did. Day after day, night after night, he clung to life, not because he wished to live, perhaps, but because he had not yet completed the one task he believed mattered more than any other. He had not yet secured the throne for Jane. Lady Jane Grey, a name that would be written into history with confusion and pity, had become his last act of defiance against the world that had taken his health, his childhood, and soon, his life. She was young, learned, obedient. She would continue his Protestant reforms. She would not let Mary undo all he had tried to build. It was a desperate gamble. But Edward was dying, and the dying do not make safe choices. And so, while his body continued to decay, and while the last fragments of his strength flickered like a candle in wind, Edward wrote, dictated, and signed the devise for the succession. A document that would crown Jane Queen. A decision that would plunge England into chaos. A decision he would not live to witness. When Edward finally slipped into death, it did not thunder through the kingdom like the passing of a great monarch. It was quiet, almost unnoticed, as if the world itself had already begun to forget him before his heart stopped beating. On the evening of the 6th of July, in the year 1553, as the sun sank behind the grey stone walls of Greenwich Palace, the boy king exhaled one final time in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit. He whispered, not as a king, not as a prophet, not even as a son, but simply as a boy who had tried to do his duty and been consumed by it. And then, the lying began. Edward's body was still warm when the council convened behind locked doors. Cloaked in silence and secrecy, his death, if made public too soon, would upend the entire line of succession, invite foreign meddling, and open the gates to Mary Tudor, the Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon who, by blood and law, was next in line for the crown. But Edward had written otherwise. In his final weeks, consumed by the rot in his lungs and the fever in his veins, he had altered the succession in his own hand, passing over both of his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, a cousin, a Protestant, and, most crucially, a controllable girl. The council, desperate to preserve their power, clung to this decision, like a drowning man clings to driftwood. They waited days before announcing the king's death, choosing instead to secure Jane, to prepare the letters, to ensure the guards at the Tower of London were loyal. They dressed the lie in velvet and parchment, stamped it with seals, and called it divine order. All the while, Edward's body lay in silence, wrapped in linen and hidden away from the world he had once ruled. Lady Jane Grey was not born for a crown. She was bookish, devout, and painfully obedient. She had never raised her voice in court, never led men into battle, and never imagined her name would be written into the pages of history. But on the 9th of July, 3 days after Edward's death, and she was summoned to Sion House and told she would be queen, she wept. She refused. She fell to the floor and cried that she was unworthy. But refusal was a luxury she was not allowed. Her father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, loomed behind the throne like a shadow waiting to claim it. And so Jane, 17 years old, with trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, accepted a crown that was never truly hers. On the 10th of July, she entered the Tower of London, not as a prisoner but as a monarch. Trumpets sounded. The people, confused and wary, looked on in silence. Somewhere behind those walls, Edward's remains still lingered, unburied, his funeral unplanned. The boy king had handed the crown to a girl, and the kingdom did not know what to do with either of them. Mary, however, did. The moment word of Edward's death and Jane's coronation reached her, she acted. She rode north, gathering supporters, invoking her birthright, invoking her mother's name, invoking justice. The people rallied to her not out of love, perhaps, but out of loyalty to the old laws, to the clear line of succession, to the memory of a king who had once cast off popes and wives alike but still called her daughter. Within 9 days, Jane's reign began to crumble. Edward had tried, in his last days, to preserve what he believed in a Protestant England, free from papal control, guided by scripture and reform. But his body had failed him, and so too did his plans. On the 19th of July, Mary entered London in triumph, cheered by crowds, welcomed by nobles, crowned in place of the girl her brother had chosen. Jane was arrested. Northumberland was executed. The council bent like reeds in wind, shifting allegiance as easily as they changed their robes. And Edward still. He was not buried. It had been 13 days since his death, and the boy king remained embalmed and sealed in his lead coffin, lying in wait for a funeral no one wanted to plan. The council, now loyal to Mary, avoided the subject. The new queen, still bitter from years of neglect and marginalization, made no effort to honor her brother with grandeur. The Protestant son of a Protestant father had placed her life in danger. His final act had been to erase her from history. Why should she weep for him now? Finally, on the 6th of August, a full month after his passing, Edward was given his funeral. It was a strange affair. The rites were Protestant, as Edward would have wanted, but the presiding queen was Catholic. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, led the service, his voice steady but hollow. The procession, long and formal, made its way from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. The coffin was accompanied by silence, not celebration. No statues were raised, no eulogies were sung, no mourning banners flew from the towers. When the coffin arrived at the abbey, it was taken not to a grand tomb, but to a plain marble vault tucked beneath the altar, small, cramped, unworthy of a king. There had once been plans to place him in Windsor, near his father Henry VIII. There had once been talk of a great sarcophagus, a lasting monument to the boy who had tried to rule before his voice had deepened. But none of it came to pass. The tomb was never built. The stones were never laid. The marble was never carved. The vault, just over 2 meters long and barely 75 centimeters wide, was closed with no inscription, no royal crest, no name. And then, it too was forgotten. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. The altar above Edward's vault was destroyed in the year 1643 by Puritan iconoclasts during the English Civil War. They had no use for kings, living or dead. They desecrated tombs, shattered effigies, tore down everything that smelled of monarchy. It's believed they may have broken into Edward's vault as well. Perhaps they saw his skull. Perhaps they stole a relic. Perhaps they simply smashed what they found and left the rest to rot. No repairs were made. In the year 1868, fragments of the altar were rediscovered. Curious hands opened the vault. They found the lead coffin warped and misshapen by time and corrosion. The wood casing had dissolved. The cloth wrappings had disintegrated. In places, the bone could be seen. There were no repairs, no replacement, no new coffin. The damage was noted, recorded, and then left as it was. Today, there is no tomb for Edward VI. Only a small slab of stone, laid in 1966 by Christ's Hospital, a charity he founded, marks the spot. It reads, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel." That is all. No crown. No epitaph. No statue. He gave England a queen it did not want. He died for a vision that died with him. And he lies in silence, in a vault the size of a pauper's grave, beneath stone, worn smooth by the footsteps of those who never learned his name. No one truly wants to die. Not even kings, especially not those who are told, from the moment they open their eyes to the world, that they were born for greatness, that they were sent by heaven to finish a father's broken work, that they carry on their shoulders not only the weight of a crown but the fate of an entire lineage. Edward never said aloud that he feared death, not in the letters he dictated with trembling hands, not in the prayers he whispered when the fevers came, not even in the final moments when the pain made him weep from his chest and he could no longer lift his head from the pillow, but he showed it. In the way he clung to writing, in the way he reshaped the future with ink and will, in the way he tried, even as his lungs collapsed inside him, to make sure his story would not end with silence. But death does not ask for permission. It did not matter that Edward was clever. It did not matter that he was devout. It did not matter that he had memorized half the scriptures of Geneva, or that he had once studied 4 languages before the age of 10. In the end, all of it, the teaching, the prophecy, the preparation became irrelevant. The moment his body betrayed him, his blood could not carry oxygen. His chest was filled with fluid and infection. His skin broke into ulcers that would not close. His bones ached with an ache no sermon could soothe. And the more he tried to hold on, the more the crown began to slip from his grasp. He died young. Too young. But it is what came after that tells the truth of how a kingdom remembers its king, or how it chooses not to. Edward's funeral, if it could even be called that, had already been overshadowed by politics, by his failed devise for the succession, by the brief and doomed reign of Lady Jane Grey, and by the fiery triumph of Mary Tudor. But the true indignity lay not in how he was replaced, but in what they did with his body. The coffin they sealed him in was meant to last forever, a thick casing of lead that would keep out time, moisture, air, and rot. A king's tomb was supposed to be eternal, untouched. Untouched. But nothing in Edward's story remained untouched. Not his crown. Not his reign. Not even his corpse. The vault they placed him in was small. Too small. Just over 2 meters in length. And barely wide enough to contain a body without bending the knees. There was no monument. No sculpture. No inscription. The plans for a tomb, once discussed in hushed tones by the council during the earliest hours of morning, were quietly abandoned. Some said money was short. Others claimed the new queen had no interest in glorifying the boy who had tried to erase her from the line of succession. Still others whispered that perhaps there was shame at the way he had died. The shame at how little had been done to stop it. Shame that the last male heir of the Tudors had ended not with a roar, but a cough. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. The world moved on. New monarchs rose and fell. Civil war broke across the land. Religious fury tore through the churches. In the year 1643, during the chaos of the English Civil War, soldiers loyal to Parliament entered Westminster Abbey and desecrated anything that reeked of royal blood. They shattered stained glass. They tore down statues. And they destroyed the altar that stood above Edward's burial place. It was never rebuilt. What happened next? No one recorded. But some things do not need ink to be remembered. The vault was disturbed. The lead coffin, once sealed to last the ages, was damaged. Whether it was broken open by vandals, or cracked by pressure, or eaten by time, no one could say. But what is certain is this: the coffin did not stay closed. In the year 1868, long after Edward's name had slipped into the back chapters of history books, workmen stumbled upon fragments of the old altar. They traced it to a vault beneath the stone. And when they opened it, expecting perhaps dust or a forgotten chapel, they found something else entirely. A boy king lying in a broken shell of metal and cloth. His coffin had warped. The outer wooden casing had disintegrated into dust. The cerecloth meant to preserve his remains had peeled away like old skin. And there, beneath centuries of neglect, lay Edward's bones. No one expected to see a skeleton, but the lead had buckled inward, pressing against the corpse, until what remained of the boy had been forced toward the surface. The gases that had built inside his body over years had likely caused the lead to bulge and break, creating pressure from within. It is even possible, though few wish to speak of it, that the coffin had partially exploded. Whatever the cause, the damage was done. The cloth was torn. The seal was gone. And Edward's skull, once crowned in gold and oil, now lay bare and hairless under dim torchlight. They documented it. They drew up reports. They took notes. But they did not fix it. No new coffin was made. No new vault was carved. The boy king who had once been heralded as England's deliverance was left where he had been found, broken, exposed, and unfinished. This was not how a Tudor king was supposed to rest. Edward had dreamed of a great monument, perhaps not for vanity, but for memory. His father, Henry VIII, had planned for a tomb of such grandeur that its shadow would stretch across history, guarded by angels, filled with music and flame. It was never completed. Edward, who had watched his father's funeral as a child, must have imagined that he too would be laid to rest with dignity, that the earth would not swallow him whole, that the people who once knelt before him would at least grant him peace in death. Instead, he was given a hole in the ground, and even that would not hold. To this day, there is no statue of Edward VI, no mural, no tapestry, no effigy that bears his likeness. His is a memory kept in fragments, a cracked vault, a warped coffin, a small plaque added in 1966 that merely states, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel." It does not say when he ruled. It does not say how he died. It does not speak of prophecy or pain or reform or failure. It simply marks the place where a boy was laid to rest and never truly allowed to sleep. Some say that ghosts cling to unfinished stories. If that is true, then Edward must still walk the halls of Westminster Abbey at night, a pale boy in a scholar's robes, coughing into his sleeve, searching for the tomb that was promised but never built. Perhaps he lingers by the broken altar. Perhaps he waits by the door, listening to the footsteps of tourists who pass above his bones without knowing who lies beneath them. Perhaps he watches the changing of monarchs and wonders if they remember his name. Or perhaps, in the end, all he ever wanted was to be remembered, not for the lies told in his name, not for the war he never chose, not for the throne he could not hold, but simply as a boy who did not want to die, and who did not deserve to be forgotten. But the coffin was opened. The silence was broken. And now, centuries later, we must ask, when we bury a king without a tomb, do we also bury the truth of who he was? It is easy to forget that beneath Westminster Abbey, beneath its arches and bells, beneath the tourists and coronations, beneath the polished marble and royal pomp, there are graves. Rows upon rows of kings and queens, of poets and generals, of forgotten children and remembered tyrants. Stone lies atop stone, and time presses downward, like a hand that never lifts. Most are at rest, but not all. Some, like Edward, never truly settled into the earth. Some, like Edward, and remain caught between reverence and neglect, interred with ceremony, but remembered with discomfort, as though their deaths were inconvenient footnotes in a story too proud to pause. He had been buried not with honor, but with haste. His funeral, conducted in a shifting political landscape, I was shaped not by love or grief, but by necessity and appearances. A Catholic queen now sat on the throne of a Protestant boy, and while Mary Tudor allowed her half-brother a service at Westminster Abbey, she did not build him a tomb. She did not carve his name in marble. She did not gather the finest masons in England to raise a monument worthy of a son of Henry VIII. She gave him silence. She gave him dust, the altar under which Edward was laid. The last mark of sacred presence above his grave remained unguarded for nearly a century. Then, in the year 1643, the storm arrived. It came not from foreign shores, but from within a war not of nations, but of belief, of scripture, of soul. The English Civil War tore the country in half, king against parliament, crown against conscience, and in that chaos, in that burning of old orders, the Puritans marched into the churches, into the sanctuaries, into the resting places of the dead, and began to erase what they saw as idolatry. They shattered stained glass that bore the faces of saints. They smashed statues that stood in silent praise. They toppled effigies and altars alike. And when they reached Westminster Abbey, they did not spare the boy who had died too soon. The altar above Edward's vault, a marble creation, crafted generations earlier, meant to guard and sanctify the place where a king lay sleeping, was destroyed. Not desecrated with malice, perhaps, but with cold intent, to the Puritan soldiers. It was stone and superstition, a monument to a dynasty that had poisoned the soul of England. They brought hammers. They brought fire. They brought scripture and fury. And when they left, the altar was gone. We do not know what else they did. There are no records. No first-hand accounts. Only gaps. But gaps in royal history are rarely innocent. The lead coffin that had once sealed Edward's remains was later found warped and partially opened. The wood casing had vanished, crumbled to dust. The cloth, meant to protect his body, had rotted. Bones lay exposed to the stale air beneath the abbey. Perhaps it was the passage of time. Perhaps it was the failure of the seal. But many believe something more violent happened, that the tomb had been disturbed, perhaps looted, perhaps desecrated during that brutal winter of rebellion. Afterward, no one repaired the damage. The altar was never rebuilt. No tomb was erected. No royal decree restored Edward's burial site. His name was not spoken in Parliament. His legacy, already fading, vanished completely from the eyes of his successors. For more than 2 centuries, no one visited his grave. No one wept for the boy who had once been the crown's greatest hope. He lay in silence, as if the earth itself had forgotten the shape of his story. Until, in the year 1868, a discovery was made. It was quiet. Accidental. Laborers, restoring parts of Westminster, unearthed fragments of stone. At first, they thought little of them, chips of broken altar. Perhaps from an earlier period of reconstruction. But as they dug deeper, they found more. A collapsed vault, a damaged coffin, and then bones, unmistakably human, unmistakably royal, still wrapped in the tattered remnants of a burial cloth, long surrendered to time. The lead had twisted inward like a crushed bell. The skeleton inside was visible through the broken seams. The cerecloth, designed to mummify and preserve, had failed utterly. The skull was bare, its sockets hollow, its jaw slightly ajar, as if caught mid-prayer. There was no hair, no trace of the fine garments he had once worn. Only bone, only loss. They did not fix it. The workers documented what they saw. A few sketches were made. A brief report was sent to the church authorities, but no further action was taken. The vault was resealed. The broken coffin was left untouched. The bones remained as they were visible, vulnerable, waiting. And in that moment, Edward became more than a forgotten king. It became a question, a wound, a warning. Because a king's tomb is never just about the dead. It is about the living. It is about how we choose to remember, how we choose to mourn, how we confront the brutal truth that even monarchs decay. Even heirs vanish. Even promises of dynastic glory can end with a boy coughing into his bedsheets, praying to a God who no longer answers. Today, if you walk through Westminster Abbey, you will not find a monument to Edward VI. You will not find a sculpture carved in his image, nor a stained glass window bearing his name. You will find a small stone slab, placed in 1966 by the Christ's Hospital, a charity he had helped to found. It lies flat against the floor. It bears a simple inscription. It is easy to miss. In memory of King Edward VI. Buried in this chapel. There is no mention of his age. No mention of the illness that consumed him. No note of the altar that was destroyed above him. No record of the broken coffin that still holds his remains. Nothing about the council that lied. Nothing about the girl who was crowned in his place. Nothing about the vault that time couldn't seal. Just a name, just a memory, just a silence deeper than the grave. Every king wants a monument, not because of vanity, though some are swallowed whole by it, but because memory, for those who wear the crown, is the only afterlife they can be sure of. They do not ask to be loved, they ask to be remembered. A statue that endures longer than their bones, a tomb that outlives the rusting of swords and the tearing of banners, a legacy carved in marble and chiseled into the prayers of the nation. But Edward was not given that. His grave bore no name. His face faded before it was ever truly known. And history, that greedy record-keeper of kings and queens, closed its book on him without finishing the final line. He had been the great hope of the Tudors, a male heir. At last, born of Jane Seymour, the only wife, Henry VIII, ever buried beside himself. The prince that bled legitimacy into a dynasty gasping for it, and for a brief, golden moment, England dared to believe that the line would continue strong, Protestant, and unbroken. But hope does not harden into history on its own. It needs time. It needs survival. It needs a life long enough to echo. Edward had none of these things. He was 15 years old when he died. 15 years to carry a kingdom on his shoulders. 15 years to turn from prophecy into dust. He was buried without a proper tomb. The vault that held him was tucked beneath a destroyed altar, barely the length of his adolescent body. Narrow, unadorned, and almost immediately forgotten. There was no marble effigy of the boy in robes. No guardian lions carved in stone. No Latin inscription crowning his name in eternity, and in the centuries that followed. Even his face began to slip from memory. No confirmed portrait remains of Edward VI painted in the final year of his life. The few images we have show a child regal. Yes, Budistan. Lacquered in symbolism. Stripped of sickness. Untouched by suffering. The real boy. The one whose bones twisted in a lead coffin, and whose final breath was a broken plea for mercy. Vanished. The silence around him grew heavy, in the reigns that followed under Mary, then Elizabeth. Then James Edward became a footnote, an awkward reminder of a failed plan. A half-written chapter between two towering sisters who would come to define an era. Mary, with her flames and her faith. Elizabeth, with her empire and her iron. But Edward, he became a gap. A pause. The boy between queens. The son who tried to change the world before he could grow into it. Even the histories written in the decades after his death struggled to place him. Protestant writers praised his intellect, his piety, his efforts to reform the church. But they did so not out of love for Edward, but out of fear of forgetting the Reformation entirely. Catholic writers, on the other hand, dismissed him as a pawn, a sickly puppet propped up by men who used his name to bleed power from the crown. Both sides wrote around him. No one wrote for him, and so the king without a face slowly became a king without a voice. In the darkness of his vault, his remains lay undisturbed, or so it was thought. But when the coffin was rediscovered in the year 1868, it told a different story. The lead casing, once intended to keep time at bay, had collapsed inward. The cloth meant to preserve the body had torn. The wooden frame had turned to rot, and through the gaps, the bones of a boy who had once ruled England stared back at those who had long since forgotten his name. His face, gone. His hair, gone. His skin, gone. What remained was skull and silence. And even then, no one repaired the damage. The men who opened his tomb did not see a king. They saw a relic, a curiosity, a piece of unfinished history exposed by accident. They recorded what they saw. They noted the condition of the vault, the warping of the coffin, the decay of the wrappings. But they did not restore the burial. They did not request a tombstone. They did not close the chapter. They merely shut the lid once more and left him there, half remembered, half erased, once again sealed in darkness. A slab was added to the floor above him. It was simple, almost too simple. In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. No date, no epitaph, no mention of the crown, the council, the conflict, or the collapse. Just a name, as if he had been no more than a gentle nobleman laid to rest under quiet stone. There are lesser lords with grander memorials than the last son of Henry VIII. And still, visitors walk above his grave every day. Their shoes echo softly across the old chapel floor. They pause to admire other tombs: Elizabeth, Mary, Henry VII. But few ever notice the plain slab beneath their feet. Fewer still know the story that lies under the stone. Almost none remember that. Just beneath the dust, there is a boy who once called himself King of England. Now, nothing more than brittle bone and broken cloth. Perhaps it is better that way. Perhaps there is mercy in the forgetting, in not having to remember that England once crowned a child, watched him wither, and buried him without promise or prayer. But perhaps not. Perhaps there is something cruel in it, something unfinished, something deeply human. Because Edward did not ask to be king. He did not raise an army or kill for the crown. He was born into it, named for it, grew mad for it. And then, as soon as the weight settled on his head, the clock began to count down. His reign lasted just over 6 years, long enough to draft laws, to sign death warrants, to imagine a world he would never live in, not long enough to be mourned properly, not long enough to be known, not long enough to escape the grave's slow forgetting. The earth has a way of erasing names, especially the names of those who were never truly allowed to live. And maybe that is Edward's true legacy, not as the Protestant prince, or the child king, or the boy who crowned Lady Jane Grey, but as a ghost in the pages of history, the king whose face faded too quickly, the king whose grave bore no name, the king whom history tried to forget. And yet, here we are, still telling his story, still listening in the dark, still wondering what it means to be a monarch whose only monument is a broken coffin. It is not the scream that lingers. It is the silence after. When a king dies, the world is supposed to respond. Bells toll. A nation pose. Chroniclers gather their quills and write his name into permanence. Mourning veils fall over the cities. Tombs are carved. Ceremonies are performed. The dead monarch is handed into legend. And the crown passes onward like fire passed from one torch to another, a light that must not go out. But when Edward died, no such fire was passed. No bell tolled loud enough to outlast the whispers. No monument was built high enough to meet the sky. Instead, there was silence. Not the sacred hush of reverence, but the uneasy quiet that falls when something is meant to be remembered but isn't. It is a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to forget how to say his name. His was a crown wrapped in contradictions too heavy for a boy to bear, too light for history to hold on to. He ruled, but did not reign. He commanded, but was never truly in command. He changed the future, but could not outlive the past. And in the years after his death, England, knowingly or not, conspired to forget him. The silence began with the council in the hours after his death, while his body still lay warm beneath sheets soaked in fever and blood. The men who had ruled through him began to speak only of succession, Not of grief, not of ceremony, not of the child they had guided, and in some ways, consumed. They spoke of Jane, of Mary, of the Protestant cause. The boy they had once protected with swords and sermons was now a political inconvenience, one whose death needed to be delayed, hidden, spun into a narrative that would keep them in power. And so Edward's death became a secret, then a scandal, then a side note. By the time it was officially announced, England had already begun to move on. The silence continued with the people. There was no national outpouring, no citywide lament, no great acts of mourning. Some wept. Of course they did. Some stood in the procession when his coffin was ferried down the river and watched candles flicker in the dusk. But most stayed home. Most spoke softly, uncertain. The king had been a boy. He had never led them into battle. He had never ruled from horseback or addressed Parliament with thunder in his voice. He had been ill, quiet. A ghost of a monarch even before death claimed him. And so, his people buried their sorrow with him, not with rage or rebellion, but with silence. Even the church, which he had tried so hard to reshape, turned its eyes elsewhere. His Protestant reforms, carefully laid out in ink and policy, were quickly rolled back under Queen Mary. His Book of Common Prayer was banned. His bishops were imprisoned. His vision for a reformed England was declared heresy. His ghost was too inconvenient to keep, and history, that old and patient chronicler, followed suit. In the official records, Edward was listed, briefly, a name, a reign, a date of birth, and a date of death. He was bracketed neatly between two queens, one who tried to unmake him, and one who tried to forget him. There were no glowing epics written in his honor. No dramatists took his story to the stage. No painters captured his final days in oils and gold leaf. He was remembered by function, not by feeling a hinge on which the Tudor door swung open and then slammed shut again. But the silence was not complete. There were always those who remembered, not in the halls of power, but in the cracks between them, in the marginalia of books, in the quiet recollections of tutors who had once read to him by candlelight, in the haunted journals of servants who had seen him waste away inch by inch. They wrote not about the king, but about the boy who tried to be strong, the boy who read scripture until his vision blurred, the boy who believed his death had meaning, the boy who thought a signed document could rewrite a dynasty. It couldn't. Not then. Not now. Even the place he was buried conspired to blur his memory. There was no grand tomb to visit, no effigy to polish, no stained glass to catch the light just right. Just a stone vault, hidden under the floor of a chapel that was later torn apart in a war he would never live to see. And when his bones were discovered 3 centuries later, warped and exposed inside a coffin that no longer held its shape, no new grave was given to him, no shrine erected, no apology made. They sealed him back into the dark. And again, silence. But silence, like death, is never absolute. Even the deepest quiet hums with the sound of what came before it. Even the most forgotten stories leave their outlines behind. Edward's silence is not empty. It is filled with the echoes of what he tried to become. A reformer, a unifier, a bridge between faith and state, between youth and rule, between hope and despair. His silence is the breath caught in the throat of history, the line that was never finished, the page that was never turned. And sometimes, late at night, when the abbey is empty and the candles flicker as if uncertain whether to burn or not, perhaps you can still feel him there beneath the stone, beneath the centuries, beneath the forgetting. Not angry, not bitter, just waiting. Waiting for someone to say his name with reverence. Waiting for someone to tell the story the world didn't want to hear. Waiting for a voice to break the silence that was built around his crown like a second coffin. Because what do we owe the kings we forget? Do we owe them tears? Do we owe them monuments? Or do we simply owe them truth? The truth that a child was asked to be a king. The truth that he tried. The truth that, in the end, he died as he lived quietly, painfully, and too soon. The silence around Edward VI is not accidental. It was built, stone by stone, lie by lie, page by empty page. But the story remains soft, slow, unfinished. And sometimes, those are the stories worth telling the most. They told him he was born to rule. Before he could form words, before he could understand the meaning of power or pain, he had already inherited both. The crown was not a choice. It was a cradle, a prophecy dressed in silks and expectation. They spoke his name in churches. They wrote it in the margins of treaties. They looked into the eyes of a sleeping infant and saw a kingdom's future strong, reformed, eternal. But wind does not hold shape, and the future is made of air. And Edward was only a boy. He tried. He truly did. In ways that perhaps mattered more than the history books allow. He tried to be wise before he was old enough to be foolish. He tried to be righteous before he was allowed to simply be good. He tried to command the fate of a nation even as his own hands shook too much to hold a quill. He signed laws with a body that would not stop failing him. He made decisions as others whispered what he should say. He dreamed of a better kingdom while coughing into his sleeve. Too proud to show pain. Too devout to curse the heavens. That is how we forget kings. Not in death, but in life when they are quiet, when they do not shout, when their greatness is gentle and breaks instead of burns. Edward ruled the wind. Or rather, he tried, and the wind, in the end, did what it always does. It moved on. His life ended in a way no child should. With blood on his lips, with shadows at his bedside, with the weight of the world still clenched in his pale fingers. No son, no queen at his side, no kingdom at his feet. Only silence. Only the ghost of his own hope slipping between his ribs like breath that would not return. There is a moment, just before sleep takes us, where we exist in neither world, not the waking, not the dreaming. A place where time does not move, where regrets breathe beside us like quiet companions. If Edward lingers anywhere, it is there, in that hush, in that pause, in that strange stillness where memory is almost enough, and grief is almost soft. He is not angry. There is no room for anger when one is this forgotten. But perhaps he waits, not for vengeance, not for glory, just for someone to say that he mattered, that a boy tried, that a life too short can still stretch far beyond its years if someone remembers. The wind is still moving. But tonight, let it pause just for a moment. Let us remember the prince who tried to speak truth into silence, who tried to turn belief into policy, who tried to rewrite the future with a shaking hand and a thinning voice. Let us remember the boy whose crown was too heavy, whose coffin was too narrow, and whose name was almost lost to dust. He did not ask to be king, but he was, and for a time, brief, flickering, quiet, he tried to be more than that. He tried to be just. He tried to be kind. He tried to be remembered. And so he shall be. Good night.